Okay, so we finished last time by talking about childhood experiences of serial killers, that they're often pretty traumatic, pretty severe in their abuse, and often mother-son issues. We'll go on to talk about some female serial killers, but maybe just worth mentioning is that, girls seem to be a bit more resilient to neglect in the early years than boys do, and especially a difficult relationship between mother and son seems to be also more linked to relationship difficulties and other emotional difficulties later in life than daughter relationships with the parents. Now, I want to talk about some biological perspectives. We've already looked at the fact that the frontal lobe, the part of the brain crucial for executive functions, complicated cognitive abilities, when damaged, makes one more predisposed to antisociality. The temporal lobe is the part of the brain that's responsible for emotions, memory, where the limbic system mostly resides, okay? The older part of the brain, right, referred to often as the reptilian brain, okay, more responsible for the basic animalistic desires and wants and basic emotions like rage and anger. And then the prefrontal cortex, especially when looking at the frontal lobe, is responsible for these more sophisticated abilities, okay, the more complicated ones. Now, I'm going to come back to talk about the temporal lobe and limbic system when we talk about psychopaths later in the course. But just to bring up now, in one study, violent offending associated with frontal lobe dysfunction. Not surprising, we've already looked at plenty of research on that topic. But temporal lobe dysfunction was associated with sexual non-violent crimes. So consensual incest or looking up illegal pornography, such as child pornography. And then dysfunction in both regions was associated with sexual violence, okay? So sexually motivated murder, sexual assaults, okay? So reminder, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the frontal lobe that acts somewhat as a mediator, right? Where impulse control takes place, okay? A number of other executive functions. Crucial for self-awareness, okay? Visual perspective taking. So it acts as a lid, right, on these more basic animalistic desires that stem from the limbic system, okay? Making sure that you have control over your emotions, control over your behavior, like the brakes on a car, right? Stopping you once you're feeling as though you're getting out of control. And we looked at a number of studies that showed us that damage to this part of the brain makes it more likely one will be impulsive, more likely they'll be violent, more likely they'll be a reactive offender. Now, the association between head trauma and violent crime is actually pretty outstanding, okay? Pretty surprising in terms of just how many violent offenders do have traumatic brain injuries in their past. If you look at the examples of serial killers, okay, again and again, you'll find examples of pretty traumatic head injuries in their past. Here's just a few as an example, but John Wayne Gacy, who had a number of hospitalizations for head trauma, but had a blood clot once on the brain after being hit by a swing. Errol Nelson was in a coma for nearly a week after crashing headfirst as a boy on a bike accident. Arthur Shawcross, who we looked at when examining the XYY profile, hospitalized 4 times for head injuries. And these are just the times in which he was hospitalized, right? If one is persistently abused across their childhood, there's going to be a number of head traumas across their childhood, okay? Not all of them hospitalized. Henry Lee Lucas, once beaten so badly, he was left in a coma for 3 days on the floor, okay? And then in one study looking at 14 juveniles on death row on the US, 100% of them had suffered some head injury in their past. and 8 of them had hospitalization for pretty severe head trauma and still had indents on their skull from the head trauma as a younger child. 9 of these juveniles out of the 14 suffered severe physical abuse. So there's obviously an interaction, okay, going on between the biological factors and environmental factors, okay? Again, persistent head trauma is going to damage this part of the brain as a consequence of persistent childhood abuse. There's a TED talk here. I might come back to the end if there's time, but it's worth checking out. Otherwise, it's on the slides. But it talks about the surprising connection that exists, okay, between brain injuries and proclivity for committing crime. I want to go a little bit further into one of the studies I told you about in the first module. You know, we looked at the fact that the normal controls had good frontal lobe function during cognitive tasks, whereas the reactive killers had frontal lobe dysfunction, right? Randy Kraft was an exception. The multiple murderer killed around 66 people over a 12-year period. And then when Rain split the predatory killers or proactive killers versus the reactive killers, only the reactive killers had this frontal lobe dysfunction, right? The proactive predatory killers seem to have good frontal lobe function. So the question might be, if these predatory killers have such good frontal lobe function, they are capable of impulse control, they do have self-awareness, visual perspective taking abilities, then why is it that they went on to commit murder? Okay, so we could go a little bit further to get some insight into this, to the subcortical regions, okay, rather than just looking at the prefrontal cortex. So the subcortical regions within the limbic system, mainly the thalamus and hypothalamus I'm talking about here, responsible for aggression, okay, responsible for triggering the fight response. These are actually more active in both types of killers than in normal controls, okay, for both the predatory proactive killers and the reactive killers. So in the case of Randy Kraft, for example, okay, we often refer to killers like that as cold-blooded because they're premeditated and calculating, okay? But that's actually a bit of a misrepresentation, okay? Because there's a lot of emotion beneath the surface in these sorts of killers, okay? In the case of Randy Kraft, he was capable of great rage, emotion, anger, just like those reactive killers, okay? But the reactive killers, because of frontal lobe dysfunction, acted on their emotions then and there. They acted impulsively, right? Because they didn't have the higher level skills to have control. The more predatory killers like Randy Kraft, okay? And Randy Kraft was described as mild-mannered, polite, soft-spoken, well-liked by those who knew him, okay? But clearly beneath the surface, he was also capable of great rage and emotion. And when these emotions were unleashed, he was capable of committing monstrous acts, right? But because of this good frontal lobe functioning, he was able to appear normal. He was able to control his impulses. He didn't have to act then and there. Instead, he could get even in a more calculating manner, act on his rage in a way in which would help him get away with the crime, okay, rather than acting spontaneously and impulsively. I'll talk briefly about the role of mental illness, but I don't want to overstate it because, like I said last time, only a small minority of serial killers will they have personality disorders, clearly. Only a small minority of them are actually legally insane, okay? Less than 1%, despite what you might see from the media or think from the media and so on. The standard of insanity is a high one to prove, proving that you were not aware of right and wrong, that you had no control over your actions, okay? This is a difficult thing to prove. And for the most part, most mental disorders don't on their own increase the odds of committing crime, okay? In fact, those with a mental illness are more likely to be a victim of crime than they are an offender, okay? So I don't want to overstate this as it might stigmatize those who are mentally ill, right? There's only really two main exceptions to disorders that do increase the odds of criminal behavior. And they are paranoid schizophrenia when it's untreated primarily, and then borderline personality disorder, especially in female forensic populations. So, for example, the base rate in women of borderline personality disorder is about 6%. But in female prisoners, it ranges from about 25 to 50% across samples, okay? Either way, it's substantially higher, okay, than the general public. Schizophrenia, 0.02% of the population have schizophrenia, but 0.3% of schizophrenic samples have committed murder, rather. Sorry, let me restate that percentage. Okay. 1 in 20,000 people will commit murder, okay, or 0.02% of people, okay. But in schizophrenic populations, 0.3%, okay. So substantially higher odds, okay, of committing this violent crime than the typical person does. And like I say, we're mainly talking here about unmedicated paranoid schizophrenia. You know, I talked about the Holmes and Holmes types and how that might overlap with mental illness and psychopathy last time. You know, the visionary and missionary serial killers, are those more likely to be high on the mental illness spectrum, okay? Paranoid schizophrenia, for example. There's a number of examples, right? But Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, for example, you know, he killed prostitutes in North Yorkshire in England. He believed that God had spoke to him at cemetery, told him to clean the streets of York by purifying it of prostitutes, okay? Clearly delusional, seeing and hearing things, okay? And that would be an example of symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia, okay? That's men overlapping then with the visionary serial killer type. The more hedonistic power control serial killers, less likely to have mental illness, more on the psychopathic side of things, okay? I'll mention the trauma control model of serial murder by Hickey. It takes into account just how many pieces of the puzzle there are to look at when we look at what causes serial killing, okay? And also acknowledges why some people respond differently to the same events. You know, obviously it's not the case that everyone who's physically abused severely becomes a serial killer. And it's also not the case that every serial killer was severely physically abused. It's just the case that so many serial killers were severely physically abused. We can't deny the association, okay? But we have to then try to explain why some people respond in a different way, okay, to the same environmental experience. So this begins with predisposing factors. So these may be some biological factors such as an irritable temperament, okay, being more sensitive, okay, something that means one might react more strongly to negative experiences. It's a simple model, but Boyce's 2019 theory theorizes that some children are orchids and some children are dandelions, meaning that children who are orchids need positive experiences in order to flourish, okay? And they're very, very vulnerable to negative experiences growing up, okay, because of their natural temperament. Whereas the children who are more like dandelions in the theory, they're more resilient to negative experiences, okay, by their temperament, okay? And so they can experience the same traumatic experiences and be less likely to be pushed on the same negative trajectory. So this will impact how people respond to traumatic events. These traumatic events, in the case of serial killing, are likely to be severe abuse and neglect, experiencing some association between sex and violence, right? The things we've looked at. This is unsurprisingly going to lead to low self-esteem. but also maybe violent fantasies and disassociation. Okay, if the reality is too painful to experience, you might disassociate by retreating into fantasies, into your own mind. Okay, and this does seem to become a pretty stable coping mechanism for serial killers. They report that early in their childhood, they used fantasizing as a way to deal with their horrible situations. And then even as adults, including when they're in prison, they're more likely to retreat into fantasies when they're stressed, upset, rather than seek out more healthy coping mechanisms like seeking social support or talking through issues or something such as this. So it becomes an unhealthy coping mechanism that they rely upon consistently. And these fantasies are often violent in nature because when they're abused, fantasizing over getting even with your abuser might be one way of giving yourself comfort, imagining yourself as too powerful to be victimized, okay? Imagining yourself as the dominant one. And then these violent fantasies become more and more of a permanent part of their personality and way of thinking. There may also be facilitators which further increase the odds that these violent fantasies will eventually translate into violent behaviors. You know, social isolation, for example. Maybe the role of the media. You know, the line from Chicago, right? If you can't be famous, be infamous. And indeed, many serial killers who reported feeling unseen throughout most of their life received acknowledgement and attention like never seen before once they were caught, right? Paul Bernardo, Ted Bundy, they received love letters and marriage proposals from women all across North America. Richard Ramirez married one of his so-called fans in San Quentin prison, right? Ed Gein, if you look up, I think you'll agree, isn't exactly George Clooney, right? But even he was getting requests for hair locks and receiving love letters and marriage proposals after he was caught. So this promise of being reported in the news and getting attention might be a further facilitator. Another one might be violent media consumption, pornography. That's a difficult one, of course, to determine, but Ted Bundy said that if it wasn't for violent pornography he had been exposed to, he would never have gone on to commit the killings that he did. That was what brought to the surface or made him aware of this interest in sexual violence that he had, the kind of torture porn that he was coming across. Indeed, you could imagine that maybe in some cases it might, you know, awaken something in someone that they didn't know was there beforehand, and then they might go further and further in pursuing it. And so all of this is interacting, of course, meaning that when one experiences trauma again in the future, this is reinforced using these unhealthy coping mechanisms. And together, this is pushing one towards homicidal behavior. There's another link here you could look up. Again, I might play if we have time, but otherwise it's worth checking out. It's an interview with Jeffrey Dahmer and his father that might give some light on his early developmental experiences. I would take it with a grain of salt. Jeffrey Dahmer puts a lot of focus on the fact he's now newly converted, found Jesus, and when he was younger, because he didn't have a religious upbringing, this is what was responsible for him becoming a serial killer. There's a lot of skeptics over whether he was genuine in his religious beliefs and what he was telling us later in his life. I would recommend the Netflix show on Dahmer. It is true, I think, in some regards, at least important ways, and it at least acknowledges a lot of the important issues, okay, surrounding the events. Jeffrey Dahmer's father was also a consultant on the show, and he doesn't hold back on his own perceived shortcomings as a father during Jeffrey Dahmer's early development. And we've also looked at faulty thinking styles that are often frequent in prisoners, right? They might be core beliefs, right, that are unhealthy, that maybe stem from social learning, or maybe cognitive dissonance, or some other unhealthy cognitive process. In one study illustrating this, they interviewed two groups of offenders, rapists and sexual murderers. So the sexual murderers are sexually motivated, right? So both have committed rape, but only the latter group have also then murdered the victims. They've interviewed them to work out what their unhealthy attitudes, unhealthy beliefs, unhealthy thinking styles are. And then they've grouped them into one of 5 groups based upon their most prominent thinking styles. Okay. Now, interestingly, there's no real difference between the rapists and sexual murderers for the first 4 groups. Okay. It's only the 5th group that the serial killers, or sexual murderers rather, fell into much larger numbers than the rapists. Okay. So those who fall in the dangerous world category, their most prominent faulty beliefs and thinking styles are that the world is a dangerous place, that it's dog-eat-dog world, that if you're not the victimizer, you'll be the victim, okay? A fixation on status and dominance and control and power, okay? Power over others so that you won't be victimized and that you have to fight for what you want. The second category have thinking styles, beliefs that are most prominently to do with male sex drive being uncontrollable, okay? That they felt as though they had little control over what they did, that it was always going to happen, okay? That there was some urge, okay, driving them forward that they felt as though they couldn't control. The third group viewed women as merely sex objects, not as actual individuals. And this was a consistent view, okay, that began very young. So at an early age, they had pretty low opinions on women, okay? Maybe because of the experiences they were brought up in and maybe some other later experiences. And for them, you know, women were merely there to serve or to be an object, okay, for their own fantasies, okay, for their own sexual gratification. The fact that this was painful or harming to women, this crime, didn't really matter to them. The fourth group then felt entitled to sex. They felt entitled for various reasons, whether the woman had flirted, or at least they thought the woman had flirted, or the way that she had dressed, the way that she had interacted, telling them that she was interested, okay? Or in some cases, they felt as though they had taken the woman out on a date and they had paid, they had given something, and therefore they felt entitled to sex in return. And if the woman wasn't, you know, willingly, okay, going to be part of this, then they were going to force her to take what they wanted. Now, this sense of entitlement was a bit more situation specific, right? It's not as a consistent negative view of women in such many regards as the type in the third category, okay, the seeing women as sex objects group. And then the final group was only frequent to the sexual murderers, okay, it wasn't frequent to the rapists. So the only real difference between the two. And for these individuals, they felt as though they could never predict how women would respond to them. They never knew how to act around women, how to get women to like them, okay? That women for them were just unknowable, and that this was a real point of frustration, a real point of anger for them, okay? Causing some, you know, resentment towards women and other negative attitudes. Okay, so I've covered quite a lot on possible causes or risk factors, at least, for serial killing, right? We've looked at those negative developmental experiences, a little bit over the role of the brain, taking into account also the risk factors we looked at in the previous module, right? Serotonin deficiency and so on, low resting heart rates. These other factors we looked at are also going to be relevant, right? We've looked at the cognitive perspective there as well, and then the role of mental illness. Any questions so far on male serial killers and the causes we've discussed? I'll talk a little bit about female serial killers. Making up about 15% of serial killers, okay? Though we're using here really a definition of at least 2 murders, okay, rather than 3. Now, there are some differences between male and female serial killers. Female serial killers typically begin killing later in life. Most male serial killers begin around 25, mid-late 20s. For female serial killers, it's usually early 30s. They're more likely to kill people they know, whereas male serial killers more likely to target strangers. The most common victim of female serial killers is their husband, okay, which is why the Black Widow type is the most common type, someone who kills for inheritance. They're unlikely to have a criminal history, unlike the male serial killers, remember, which is 50-50, right? 50% have some criminal conviction, 50% don't. And the female serial killers tend to be place specific. Unsurprising, because if they're mainly killing spouses, it's going to be in the household. But male serial killers more likely to be geographically mobile, moving from site to site. When it comes to male serial killers, typically, the more geographically mobile they are, the further they kill from home, the more organized they are, okay? The closer to home they kill, the more disorganized they are on that dichotomy. And female serial killers, less likely to use violent means of death, okay? Male serial killers usually kill via stabbing, shooting, strangling. For female serial killers, poison is the most frequent means, okay? The most well-known example is Eileen Wuornos, okay, which the movie Monster is about, also known as the Florida Highway Killer. She's an unusual female serial killer, okay, in that her motivation seems to be in part about power control over the victims and also perhaps a hedonistic element to it. Remember, hedonistic lust is the most common motivation for male serial killers. It's a very, very infrequent motivation for female serial killers, okay? Now, Holmes and Holmes also have a model for female serial killers, just like they do have for males, based upon motivation. There's clear overlap, right? The visionary serial killer, like the male visionary, is that who is delusional, okay, experiencing hallucinations, hearing things that aren't there, seeing things that aren't there, and this delusion is playing part of what's driving their killing. The second type is the comfort-orientated serial killer or profit murderer, okay? That would be the Black Widow, okay, who's killing for financial gain. So like I say, usually killing one's husband to get inheritance, but it could be some other relationship, right? So long as that's the goal. The third type is power-seeking serial killers, okay? In most forms, not very frequent amongst female serial killers. The main subtype here is the medical murderer, okay? The angel of death, who you've probably seen in some TV shows and movies, right? The nurse who enjoys this power over life and death, making the victim more sick when they want the victim to be more sick, making the victim well if they want the victim to be more well, and then being responsible ultimately for the victim's death. Quite often tied to this is a hero complex. Jean Jones here in the US was a nurse who would put babies in a situation in which they were near death in hopes of being able to save them, because maybe that would give some boost to her ego, also give some attention, okay? But unfortunately, many times she was unsuccessful, and so she caused the death of those infants. There was a case only a few months ago in England. I've forgotten her name, but it was a similar case. A nurse, quite a young nurse, found to be responsible for murdering a number of infants in her care. The main theory over what was motivating her seems to be the attention that it was getting, that she was working in a place where there was lots of death, and that was bringing about lots of attention on her with her colleagues and friends and so on. And then the fourth type is infrequent for female serial killers, but it's the hedonistic type who kills for sexual excitement or some other form of excitement, okay, that it's giving them a rush in some way, or it's part of some sadistic sexual fantasy. But female serial killers are much more likely to have an accomplice than male serial killers. So this final type is the disciple serial killer. Okay, a female serial killer who's operating really under the influence of a male figure. So this would be like the Manson cult members, right? Who committed murders following Charles Manson. So the murders of Sharon Tate and so on. It's harder to find examples of female serial killers in fiction, but here's just a few. Are you familiar with any? So this is Anne Wilkes from Misery, right? Where do you think she would be placed in these types? Someone said medical murderer. Sorry? Yeah, medical murderer, yeah. Yeah, indeed. I mean, she is a nurse, so and she does seem to enjoy the power over being the one to comfort the victim, right? Who's the writer that she's obsessed with. Do you guys know who this one in the middle is? Anyone? No? Okay, it's Villanelle from Killing Eve. She's a contract killer, but she definitely loves what she does, okay? So there's a bit of overlap there between the comfort-orientated and hedonistic. Do you know this one on the far right? Yeah, you're nodding your head. Yeah, a few of you, right? Love from you, right? Okay, where would you place her? Okay, because she's operating under Joe. I don't remember if she kills before she meets Joe or not. She does? Okay, so maybe they're not a disciple then. Where do you think she may fall? Okay. So I think probably hedonistic, right? There seems to be some thrill to it. So female serial killers twice as likely to have an accomplice, okay, than male serial killers. About 50% of them do. We can also look at various types of accomplices as well. Okay, this is a model by Gurian. So the first type here is the sexual sadist. So this is typically a young couple, male and female, who are killing together as part of some sexual fantasy. Okay. So both equally responsible, both motivated by enjoying the act of killing because it's, again, part of the fantasy that they're living together. Spree murderers, okay, those that kill from site to site, usually as part of some larger criminal activity, such as a series of arsons or a series of thefts, okay? It's some sort of spree, okay? There's a Criminal Minds episode that illustrates it well, in which you have the young married couple. I've put it in the video that I put on Canvas if you want to. I'll tell you which one I'm talking about. And then the third type here is also the Black Widow-like strategy, but a male is also in on it. Okay, so boyfriend and girlfriend are in on it together. They planned for the girl to marry some rich husband, and then they'll kill him together, and then together split the inheritance. Okay, some Black Widow strategy such as this, in which the two are equal partners. And then you have cults or religious murderers. So these would be like the Manson family cult members that I talked about, right? Under the influence of a cult leader. And then you have male serial murderer, female accomplice, in which the female is not as active, okay, as the male is in wanting the serial killing. They're aiding and abetting. They're either luring the victim to the male, or they're disposing of the body afterwards and helping clean up the scene, okay? They have some secondary role, okay? But it's the male who is actually doing the killing, who wants to do the killing. The female partner is assisting, okay, in some secondary way. Does that make sense? Is there any questions about the types? So a pretty clear example is Paul Bernardo and Carla Homke, nicknamed the Barbie doll and Ken doll of serial killers by the Canadian press. Murdered together a number of young teenage girls, including Carla's younger sister. The way in which this played out in court was that Carla testified against Paul Bernardo for a less severe sentence, arguing that she was an accomplice. So arguing, the narrative really was arguing that they fall under this last type, okay? That she felt forced into it in some way, but it was really him who was wanting the killing and doing the killing. There's a lot of critics over that. A lot of people who argue that she was actually much more actively involved, okay, than what was presented at court, and that they would more be like the sexual sadists type, okay, who were both, pleased by this horrible act of raping and killing young girls. Yeah.
Could it have started by the murder accomplice and then the
I guess. Maybe through some kind of like Stockholm syndrome thing, you think, in which initially she felt forced into it, and then eventually she came to convince herself she was enjoying it. Something like that's possible. Okay. I don't know if that applies in this exact case. I don't know all the details on what happened in the initial killings. I briefly want to mention mass killing and spree killing, just really so you're aware of how they are distinct from serial killing. Okay, so long as you're aware of the difference, that's what's important. Now, rampage killing is an umbrella term, okay? It refers to mass killing and spree killing, okay? It's an umbrella term for both. Mass killing is killing multiple people at one site at one point in time, right? Unfortunately, these sorts of events are in the news all the time, right? So you know what I'm talking about. Spree killing differs from that in that it moves from site to site, okay? So in mass killing, it's at one location, okay? Whereas in spree killing, it's starting at one location, and then they're moving to another location and moving on for as far as they can go until they're stopped by police, okay? Psychologically, it is very, very different between mass killers and spree killers. Both were quite likely to be depressed, wanting to end their own life, take as many people with them. This ending their life, it could be suicide, or it could be suicide by cop, right? Which is when one basically forces the police into shooting them by raising your weapon to them. They're clearly very different from serial killers. Serial killers are not looking to end their life. They're not looking to get caught. Okay, they want to get away with this for as long as they can so that they can continue killing. So that's unlike rampage killers, right? Rampage killers often also have experienced some recent stressor, trigger, okay, that's pushed them over the edge. A divorce, or losing one's job, or financial bankruptcy, or something that's acted as a kind of last straw. So I want to briefly just talk about another few types of murder, okay? One is spousal killing. Now, we looked at this already, that women are more likely to be killed by an intimate partner than a male is. In fact, she's 9 times more likely to be killed by her spouse than she is by a stranger. And they're 5 times more likely to be killed by a spouse than a man is. The main motivation behind these killings is sexual jealousy or fears over estrangement. Okay. In a number of these cases, the males have a pretty severe insecure attachment style. The idea of abandonment or rejection is too much for them to handle. And so they act out of control in response when they think the other person has been unfaithful or they think they're about to be left. There is also some, you don't need to know this for the exam, by the way, it's just further information, but interestingly, some neuropsychological research has found that men who commit spousal abuse have a more active amygdala in response to negatively charged words, indicating that they're more effectively hypervigilant, okay, that they're more responsive to negative emotional events in their life and they react to it with more intensity. But by far, estrangement, sexual jealousy, these are the main motivations. 60% of spousal killings in this study, and also a history of domestic violence, okay, prior to the killing. So in many of these cases, there was already domestic violence, and then it was getting worse and worse. And then maybe the abuser didn't mean in that moment to kill, okay, but it was just that they hit them too hard or something such as this, okay. There are a number of risk factors that we can identify that increase the odds that domestic violence will escalate eventually to spousal homicide. So if the abuser abuses substances, if they've previously threatened the victim with a weapon, if they've previously stalked the victim, if there's been estrangement, if there's sexual jealousy, all of this increases the odds that domestic violence will result in homicide. If there's a larger age difference between the partners, if the offender witnessed abuse in childhood, if they have a personality disorder, particularly psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder. And also husbands commit suicide about a third of the time after killing their partner. The other type of killing I want to tell you about is filicide, when parents kill their own child, responsible for about 2.5% of homicides annually in the US. There's really 3 main types of filicide. The first is neonticide, in which the baby is killed within the first 24 hours after birth. Okay, so that's what this term means. Okay, filicide being committed 24 hours after birth, within the first 24 hours. Usually it's an unwanted pregnancy. Quite often the pregnancy has been concealed. Okay, and then in order to spare the embarrassment or shame, okay, from parents or family finding out, okay, that they got pregnant, they're killing the offspring. The second type is the battering mother. So this would be obviously someone who is abusing their child. And again, it might not be the case that they intended in that moment to kill the child, but again, they've maybe struck them too hard that time, that the abuse has got too far, okay? And so it's maybe somewhat accidental, but of course, they're still criminally responsible. And then the final type is a mother who is mentally ill, okay, or a parent who's mentally ill. And part of this delusion is what's causing the homicidal behavior. Now, the most common type of mental illness in this category is postpartum psychosis. Now, postpartum mental illness is not uncommon. Okay, 85% of women experience blues after giving birth. It usually lasts no more than 12 days. About 10% of women have postpartum depression, which is just the same as clinical depression in terms of its symptoms and diagnosis. Obviously, the difference is that it's occurring immediately after birth, and it usually lasts several months at most, okay? But the most severe type of postmortem mental illness is postmortem psychosis, which affects about 0.1% of women. And this includes suicidal fantasies, homicidal fantasies, violent fantasies, okay? And psychotic breaks as well at its most extreme. So that's in regards to mothers who commit filicide. Of course, fathers can also kill their children. They're much less likely to suffer from mental illness than mothers who kill their children. They're more likely to be under the influence of drugs or alcohol. They're more likely to have a criminal history, and they're more likely to be having committed domestic violence, to be abusers. Okay. Any questions so far? I'm not going too fast. Yeah.
Isn't there kind of, side that with moms where they want to like restart their lives? Like they want to get with a different guy because they want her kids, so she doesn't get.
Yeah. So killing to start over again. Probably maybe within the neoticide. I guess it could be once the child is a bit older. You're right, that doesn't really fall within any of these three categories, but that could be a motivation. Yeah. There's certainly some evolutionary perspectives on that type of killing. Yeah. Yeah.
Like mental illness and whereas like fathers, but it happens to only say happens to God.
They're less likely to have mental illness, the fathers. Okay. The rest is true. Yeah. More likely to be abusers, under the influence. Criminal history. Yeah. Men who kill their children versus their spouse.
Like both.
Okay, if they killed both. But that's a type of murderer, often called family annihilator, who kills all of their family. Fairly rare, but it has happened on several occasions. But that's a pretty unique type. Usually someone who is incredibly depressed, has some sort of major stressor in their life, and they want to maybe start over again. They want to avoid the shame and that they may experience from their family when their family is maybe disappointed in them having gone bankrupt or lost their job or whatever it is. But yeah, there's been a few cases like that. Yeah. Anything else? So make sure you can tell the difference between the different types of murder, manslaughter, describe common characteristics of serial killers, the types, and some of the various causes that we've looked at, okay? And then female killer types, accomplice types, the types of rampage killing, and some of the information there on filicide and spousal killing as well.